Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are talking about the First Amendment today of the Constitution. I'm going to show you the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. You can remember them. They are RAPS, R-A-P-P-S, religion, assembly, press, petition, and speech. And they all have to deal with the same kind of concept of freedom of expression. And my screen is really big. I don't know why it is like that. So we'll try to make it a little bit smaller, or I'm just going to have to move it around. All right. So let's get started on this. All right. So remember yesterday I talked a little bit about the difference between civil rights and civil liberties. Civil liberties are individual freedoms we have the government cannot take from us, like the right to religion, right to privacy. Civil liberties are things the government gives to groups to correct past discrimination, like voting rights. But we're just going to focus solely on the First Amendment, and we're going to focus on the civil liberties for the next couple chapters. All right, so first we're going to talk about freedom of religion, true or false. Freedom of religion is the first thing mentioned in the Bill of Rights, and that is absolutely true. The reason it's mentioned first is because the founding fathers did not want people to be forced to follow a specific religion. A lot of people assume that's because the founding fathers were very religious, but that's quite the contrary. They weren't really that religious because they wanted to make sure that they weren't forcing anybody into a certain type of religion. So there's 2 parts to the freedom of religion section of the First Amendment. One is the Establishment Clause. It says that the government cannot make any laws about the establishment of a religion. So this is where Thomas Jefferson kind of said there should be a wall of separation between church and the state. It doesn't say that in the Constitution. It's just his interpretation of it. So what that means, like, you can't have a government like favor one religion over another or establish one religion as being like an official religion. So we don't have an official religion in this country. A lot of countries do. Mexico is Catholicism. The UK is the Church of England. Russia is the Russian Orthodox Church. So we're one of the countries that doesn't have a religion, official established religion. There's been some questions about this, so we're looking at that with some of these court cases because there's always some gray area to the. Oh, look at I'm making myself smaller. Yay, getting you out of the way. Okay, so there were a couple of court cases where they felt that religion was kind of intertwining with public schools. And remember, public schools are like government schools, basically, because they're funded by taxpayer dollars. And there was one where there was in McCollum versus Board of Education, students were forced to pray in school, in a public school. In a private school, they can force them to do that all they want, but in a public school, you can't. And the court said you cannot pray in school. You cannot have mandatory state-enforced prayer in school. Can you pray in school? Yeah, absolutely. But I can't force you to pray. The school can't make a law that says you have to pray. And you can read the Bible in school, but not for worship. So like, in a history class, for instance, you could read parts of the Bible and compare it to parts of the Quran or parts of the Torah. As long as you're looking at that and just looking at it in an objective, secular, non-religious way, that's totally fine. But like if I were to have you read the Bible and then say, okay, let's bow our heads and pray to Jesus Christ, you can't do that. That is unconstitutional because it violates the Establishment Clause. There was also one in New Mexico where before a football game at a public school, they would do a prayer right before the game started. That went all the way to Supreme Court, and they said you can't do that, not before sporting events. Now, I know some of you who are in sports are like, well, wait a second, we do a prayer in the locker room before we go out on the floor. That's fine if it's student-led. If it's state-sanctioned or school-sanctioned at a public school, it cannot happen. If it's voluntary, totally fine. Next, we're going to look at the second part of the freedom of religion section of the First Amendment. That's the Free Exercise Clause. The government cannot restrict any person's religious practices, but there are some exceptions to that rule too. You cannot practice something that interferes with the peace, good order, and morals of society. For instance, I'm Catholic, so I can't go and murder someone and say, oh, my Catholic faith told me I could do that. That's legal, right? No, it's illegal. It's against, first of all, you're breaking the law. Second of all, it goes against the good order and morals of society, obviously. But there was a case. Now that's an extreme example, okay? But there were cases where there's some gray area where a Native American group where two men were smoking peyote as part of a Native American ritual, went to work, got fired, took it to the Supreme Court, said, listen, we should not have gotten fired. It's part of our freedom of religion protection in the First Amendment. We're protected by the Free Exercise Clause. And the court said, no, you are not. If it is an illegal activity, it can't be protected by the First Amendment. So there are exceptions to these rules. And there's a lot of gray areas, and we're going to see that over the next few weeks with these chapters. All right, next is freedom of speech. I'm now RAPS is the way to remember it: religion, assembly, petition, press, speech. But like I'm just showing you the order that it is in the actual Constitution. However, to remember the 5 freedoms, just remember that little acronym and it'll help you. All right, so there's different types of speech. What I'm doing right now is known as pure speech. That's symbolic speech, where it's speech using actions or objects. Are there limits? Of course there's limits. And actually there's limits that were done that were actually deemed unconstitutional. So there's this thing called seditious speech where you speak out against the government. And they actually made laws about it. John Adams made a law. Woodrow Wilson made a law that says you cannot, seditious speech is illegal and you can get arrested for it, but the courts found that to be unconstitutional eventually. So you can say bad things about the government, but you can't, what's the word I'm looking for? You can't advocate violence against government or an overthrow, but you can speak ill of them. It's okay to do that. Here's a speech you can't do. You can't say anything that would trigger an immediate danger where criminal acts follow. So this is like why you can't say bomb on an airplane or fire in a movie theater, because it is because of the court case Schenck versus the United States. They said you can't do things like that. You can't just yell something and where people immediately panic. That is an illegal form of speech. You also, another illegal form of speech is defamation, where you have a verbal attack on another person's name or reputation. It's not illegal. What's the word I'm looking for? It's, you can sue someone for that. You can, they won't go to jail for it, but what you can do is sue someone for doing that and take them to court over it. There's different types of defamation. There's slander, which is spoken, and libel, which is written or published. And you can remember the difference because slander and spoken, it's both starts with an S. But a lot of times you probably have seen like, Us Weekly or Life and Style or People Magazine where they or Star, where they make up stuff about celebrities all the time. And you're thinking like, well, why wouldn't a celebrity sue these people? They absolutely could if they have proof of it, because celebrities want attention. Any news is good news, Freedom of the press is next. That's probably one of the freest forms there's probably the least restrictions on freedom of the press of any of the 5 freedoms. There is a thing that a lot of countries use called prior restraint, where they look at what's going to be published before it goes out and the government can stop it from being printed. It's almost always illegal. The only time that it's really allowed is if it's a matter of national security. Well, the New York Times published what were known as the Pentagon Papers, which was proof that the government was lying to us during the Vietnam War about what they were doing. And the U.S. tried prior restraint with that because they're like, that's national security. And the court said, no, it wasn't a case of national security, that they could print it. So that gave even more freedom to the press. There are some restrictions. I'm sure you guys have seen this with movies and radio and TV, where they have restrictions on what can be shown, and they have to have a rating system. The ones that tend to have the most restrictions are anything that's a public airwave. Basically, think of if you jerry-rigged an antenna on top of your house, what TV stations you would get: CBS, ABC, NBC, or anytime you're in the radio and it's free radio, they have the most restrictions because it's the easiest to get to and anyone can get to it. And who's enforcing this? The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. And they basically say you have to have a license to be able to have a TV station or a radio station. And if you don't follow our rules, we're not giving you a license. And sometimes they'll fine the places too if they, what's the word I'm looking for? Violate what codes they're supposed to follow. So another thing that the press got, and this has given them a lot more power to get information from the government, is the Freedom of Information Act. So that basically means that they can ask for copies of any federal, state, or local records, and those places have to give it to them. So in the name of being more transparent to the citizens. They also have protections. They have what are known as shield laws, where if they ever get subpoenaed or called into court to be a witness, they do not have to identify their witnesses, their anonymous sources, because then it protects their safety too. Freedom of assembly, we've seen this a lot lately. It's allowed on public grounds as long as it's not disorderly. If you assemble on someone's private property and they don't want you there, that is 100% illegal. That's what we saw in the case of that mansion in St. Louis. Or if it's disrupting the good morals of society, again, like we saw, they got arrested. Many of them got arrested for blocking the highways. You can't do that as well. Some states are even trying to make laws where you can, like, if you're in a car and they're in your way, like, you won't get in trouble if you run them over. Now, usually when there's protests going on and there's going to be law enforcement there just to make sure everything's peaceful. But if things get out of hand, people will get arrested. I believe in the Louisville, after the Breonna Taylor decision, there was about 100 arrests the other night. So that's an example of where law enforcement will get involved. But here's the deal. These freedoms aren't meant to protect popular things. They're really meant to protect the unpopular. And as much as it might make us cringe one way or another, they're meant to protect unpopular things, because people aren't going to like get mad about the popular stuff. They get mad about the unpopular stuff, but that's what's protected. You know, like when there was, if there's a KKK rally, or they're protected. They have the right to do that. As awful as it is, they can do that. People who disagree with the Black Lives Matter protests, they have the right to do that. Could there be violence? Yes, there could. Has there been violence? Yes, there has. But they have, as long as it's peaceful and as long as they're not violent and they're following the local codes of conduct, they're 100% allowed to do that, even if people disagree with it. And then the last one is the freedom of petition. A petition is a formal written document sent to the government with complaints on it. So for instance, this was an example of one that was done. It was the Karma the Husky petition. They were going to euthanize this dog, and people didn't want that to happen. It was like a government agency that was going to do that. So they did this huge petition to save him. I know there's been petitions, to impeach President Trump, to try to remove him from office, and other things like that. Do petitions necessarily change a law? Do protests necessarily change a law? No, they just bring attention to the politicians in hopes that they might make a change. So that's it. The 5 freedoms: RAPS, religion, assembly, petition, press, speech. Those are the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. Next, I'm going to give you a few case studies, and you got to tell me, are those protected by the First Amendment or are they unconstitutional? Have a good one.